I'm Luke Story. For the past 22 years, I've been relentlessly committed to my deepest passion, designing the ultimate lifestyle based on the most powerful principles of spirituality, health, psychology, and personal development. The Lifestylist Podcast is a show dedicated to sharing my discoveries and the experts behind them with you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Here we are. Man, I'm really excited to have this conversation. You've been on my list of target guests for quite a while now, and the universe has aligned, and here we are finally. And I've been listening to a lot of your content lately, and am just so fascinated and curious about your point of view on some of the current events and all the work that you've been doing. So I thought perhaps, because we have a finite period of time and I could probably ask you questions all day long, being someone who's completely obsessed with water and the quality of drinking water, the quality of fishing, swimming water, I'd like to ask you how you first chose that as a venture to support in terms of environmentalism.
How I got into water protection?
Yeah.
Well, it was a natural fit for me because I grew up on the water. I grew up on the ocean. By the way, my voice is really bad today, and I explain this sometimes when I do electronic media that I used to have a very strong voice until I was 42 years old, and then I got struck by this disease called spasmodic dystonia that makes my voice tremble like this. Usually, if I speak for a while, it starts to clear up. So I'm hoping that'll happen today. But water was just a natural fit for me. I grew up on the ocean, on the Atlantic. I was in the water every day. My father taught us to do whitewater kayaking. I mean, when I was 10 years old, I was kayaking with some of the best whitewater in the country and in the world, and I've been doing that my whole life. But I love fishing and every water sport. And then in 1984, I went to work for a group of commercial fishermen on the Hudson River whose livelihoods were being destroyed by pollution. So we have on the Hudson the oldest commercial fishery in North America. It's 350 years old. Many of the people that I represented for 35 years on the Hudson were people whose families had been fishing the Hudson since Dutch colonial times. It was a traditional gear fishery. They used the same fishing methods that were taught by the Algonquin Indians, the original Dutch settlers of New Amsterdam, and then passed down through the generations. And in 1966, Penn Central Railroad began vomiting oil from a 4.5-foot pipe in the Croton-Harmon Rail Yard. The oil went up the river on the tides. It blackened the beaches. It made the shad taste of diesel so that they couldn't be sold at the Fulton Fish Market in New York City. And all of the people in this little fishing village called Crotonville, New York, it was one of the enclaves of the Hudson's commercial fishery, came together in an American Legion Hall. It was the only public building in the town. It was a very patriotic community. Crotonville had one of the highest mortality rates in World War II of any community in the country. Virtually the entire male population joined the Marines the day after Pearl Harbor. These weren't radicals. They weren't militants. They were people whose patriotism was rooted in the bedrock of our country. But that night they started talking about violence. They talked about, somebody suggested that they put a match to the oil slick coming out of the Penn Central pipe and burn up the pipe. Somebody said they should roll up a mattress, jam it up the pipe, and flood the rail yard with its own waste. Somebody else suggested that they float a raft of dynamite into the intake of the Indian Point power plant. These are all, Korean War vets, Vietnam War vets, and World War II vets. And at that time, Indian Point power plant was killing 1 million fish a day on its intake screens and taking food off their family tables. And then a guy stood up who was a first lieutenant in Vietnam, and he had a combat veteran, Bob Boyle. He had come back and he had become the outdoor editor of Sports Illustrated, writing about hunting and fishing. And he had written an article about angling in the Hudson 2 years before, and in researching that article, he came across an ancient navigational statute called the 1888 Rivers and Harbors Act that essentially allowed anybody who was harmed by pollution to turn the polluter into the U.S. attorneys to create a case, turn that polluter in, and then collect a bounty. There's a bounty provision, and the law had never been enforced in 80 years. But he stood up. He had sent actually a copy of that law to the libel lawyers at Time Magazine, at Time Inc., which owns Sports Illustrated. And he said, "Is this still good law?" And they sent him a memo back saying, in 80 years, nobody's enforced it, but it's still on the books. That evening, when all these men and women, 300 people who came to that meeting, were talking about violence, he stood up in front of them and he said, he showed them the memo, he showed them the law, and he said, we shouldn't be talking about breaking the law, we should be talking about enforcing it. And they resolved at that time they were going to start a group called the Hudson River Fishermen's Association, which later became Riverkeeper. They were going to go out and track down and prosecute every polluter on the Hudson. And 18 months later, they collected the first bounty in United States history under this 19th century statute. They shut down the Penn Central Pipe for good. They got to keep $2,000. There were 2 weeks of wild celebration in the town, and then they used the money that was left over to go after Ciba-Geigy, Tuck Tape, Standard Brands, American Cyanamid, the biggest corporations in America, and winning hundreds of thousands of dollars. In 1973, they collected the highest penalty in United States history against a corporate polluter. They got $200,000 from Anaconda Wire and Cable for dumping toxics at Hastings, New York. They used that money to construct a boat, which they called the Riverkeeper. And then in 83, they hired their first full-time Riverkeeper. They got $2 million from Exxon that year. Used the money for stealing water from the Hudson. They used that money to build this boat and to hire a full-time waterkeeper, a former commercial fisherman named John Cronin. He hired me like 9 months later as the prosecuting attorney for the group. And during my time there, we brought over 500 successful lawsuits against Hudson River polluters. We forced polluters to spend $5.5 billion on remediation. And today, the Hudson, when I started working on it, was a national joke. It caught fire. It turned different colors depending on what color they were painting the GM, the trucks at the GM plant in Terrytown. It was dead water, zero dissolved oxygen for 20-mile stretches north of New York City, south of Albany. And today it's the richest waterway in the North Atlantic. It produces more pounds of fish per acre, more biomass per gallon than any other waterway in the Atlantic Ocean. The miraculous resurrection of the Hudson inspired the creation of other waterkeepers, first on Long Island Sound, commercial fishermen there, and then on the Delaware, then San Francisco Bay. We own a waterkeeper name, Riverkeeper, Soundkeeper, Baykeeper, all of those. And we started, and in 93, the first, I think, 16 waterkeepers started an umbrella group called the Waterkeeper Alliance, which I'm president of. And it's now the biggest water protection group in the world. And we have 350 waterkeepers. Each one has a patrol boat. Each one of them has a full-time paid waterkeeper, and they all sue polluters. And we have them in 46 countries. We're the largest and fastest growing water protection group in the world. So that's kind of my evolution. And that's a long answer to your question about how I got into this racket.
No, man, it's amazing, and I thank you for doing that work. That's fantastic. It's it's, as I said, something that's near and dear to my heart, being a nature lover, but specifically water. And when I come across a body of water that's polluted, it's really sad, because it's the lifeblood of the planet. And so I just commend you for that work. And thanks for the story. I actually didn't know all the backstory about it. So that's really cool. I guess I want to go into now. I mean, first thing I want to ask you actually is this. You've been so outspoken about the issues with vaccine safety and talking about 5G and things like that, and other issues that the opposition has so much power behind, and yet you remain. I'm curious how much you've been censored. I'm always kind of surprised when I see you on Instagram, and you're really smart about posting studies and facts, and it's not just hyperbole and, tinfoil hat stuff. It's just fact, and perhaps that's why. But have you been facing, as of late, some of the censorship that's happening to people that are outspoken about these type of issues?
Yeah, but we've been censored for at least since 2008. Even before that, but I published my first article in 2005 in Rolling Stone magazine, and that was an article that let me just tell you kind of how I got into this, and then I'll explain what happened, the kind of the history, the evolution of the censorship, because we've always had censorship. But I was suing coal burning, a group, probably about 40 coal burning power plants and cement kilns. Back in 2004, 2005. In 2003, the FDA published a report that said every freshwater fish in America had dangerous levels of mercury in its flesh. And it really struck me that we're living now in a science fiction nightmare where my children, the children of every other American, could now no longer engage in the seminal primal activity of American youth, which is to go fishing with their father or mother in the local fishing hole and then come home and safely eat the fish. And all of the water keepers were united in thinking that mercury really was a huge threat to everything that we believed in and everything we cared about. We started suing coal burning power plants, the principal source of mercury, and cement kilns, probably number two. And we started suing them. And a lot of the different water keepers were suing them particularly in the provinces of Canada and in the US. And I was managing a lot of that litigation. I was going around the country and Canada talking about it. And almost everywhere I stopped to give large speeches to, 1,000 or 2,000 people, there would be these women who would show up and sit in the front row, and they all kind of looked the same. They were very well dressed. A lot of them were professionals. They were doctors, lawyers, pharmacists, scientists, psychologists, etc. And they all had intellectually disabled children. And they all believed that the vaccines, particularly mercury in the vaccines, had injured their children. And they would come up to me after these speeches and talk to me in kind of a respectful but vaguely scolding way, saying, if you really are concerned about mercury in exposures to kids, you need to look at the vaccines. And it's not something that I wanted to do because I had spent my life, or a lot of my life, doing what essentially was a family business of working in the area of intellectual disabilities in children. My aunt, Eunice Shriver, who was my godmother, founded Special Olympics. I worked at Special Olympics almost every weekend when I was a kid, from when I was 8 years old, as a hugger and then a coach. I worked for 200 hours at Wassaic Home for the Retarded when I was in high school in upstate, up in the Hudson Valley, New York. And it was part of our family culture to be involved with, particularly with children with intellectual disabilities. But it wasn't that I had kind of carved out my own area that I wanted to do with my life, which was to protect water and fisheries and wildlife, et cetera. And I didn't really want to get sucked back into that. So I resisted when these women, and I didn't know anything about vaccines. So all my kids were vaccinated. I thought, I never knew that there was any problem with vaccines. I just assumed they were, great for you. And then one of these women came to my home in the summer of 2005. And her name was Sarah Bridges. She was a psychologist from Minnesota. And her son, Porter Bridges, had gotten a $20 million judgment from the vaccine court, Federal Court of Claims that does vaccine. It's where you go if you've been injured by a vaccine. And the court found that his autism was caused by the vaccine. And they gave him a $20 million settlement. She didn't want it to happen to anybody else. And she came to my house with a a stack of scientific studies that was 18 inches deep. She found my house in Hyannisport, my little bungalow, and she put all those studies on my front porch. And she said, I'm not going to leave here until you read those. And, I'm accustomed to reading science. I've had hundreds of environmental cases. Virtually all of them involve some kind of scientific controversy. So if I weren't comfortable reading science, I wouldn't be very good at my job. And I started reading these studies, and before I was 6 inches deep in this pile, I was struck by this huge delta between what the regulatory agencies and the pharmaceutical companies were saying about vaccine safety and what the actual published peer-reviewed science was saying. And then I started calling up regulatory officials who I knew. Anthony Fauci, Francis Collins, my whole family knew them. My family is completely intertwined with the public health regulatory system in this country. The major institutes at NIH and HHS are called the Kennedy Krieger Institute and the Eunice Shriver Institute. My uncle, Ted Kennedy, was chairman of the health committee for 50 years in the United States Senate and was helping to pick these agency heads, dealing with them daily and winning budgets for them. So, my family there's no family that was closer to the public health regulatory apparatus in this country than my family. And I started calling them and asking them some basic questions. One of the questions I asked Francis Collins and Kathleen Stratton, who was the head at that time of the Institute of Medicine, and Paul Offit, who was kind of one of the deities of vaccinology in this country. And they all said, but, when they couldn't answer questions, these regulatory officials would say, call Paul Offit, he'll know. And Paul Offit was not, it was an odd thing for government regulators to tell me, we can't answer that, ask Paul Offit, he's an industry guy. And so that kind of made me think, because you wouldn't, if I was calling EPA engineers to ask, or scientists to ask about a problem, it would be very weird for them to direct me to somebody who worked for the coal industry and say, you better ask him. Well, it was the same thing.
Right.
When I talked to Offit and Kathleen Stratton, I asked them the same question, which is, how can you tell pregnant women not to eat tuna fish because there's mercury in tuna fish, and at the same time you're giving them vaccines, flu vaccines, and DTaP vaccines that contain huge loads of mercury, much higher, over 100 times what EPA says is safe. And none of them could answer that question. Paul Offit finally told me, he said to me, Bobby, and Paul Offit, my inclination was to like him. He told me, I got into public health because of your father. I love your family and all this. My inclination was, to like the guy. Then I started asking him questions, and I could tell he was either lying or he just was unfamiliar with the science, but mainly he was lying. And on that particular question, he said to me, kind of in a patronizing way, well, Bobby, the thing is that there's two kinds of mercury. There's a good mercury and a bad mercury. And the good mercury is the ethyl mercury in vaccines is good mercury because your body excretes it immediately, and the methyl mercury in fish is bad. And I knew at that time, immediately, that, that is not true. His argument was not with me, it was with the periodic tables, because there's no such thing as good mercury. And I had also read the studies on the excretion of mercury, and I knew by then there's a famous study by a guy called Thomas Burbacher, who's very, very reputable, that NIH paid for, where he said, no, the ethylmercury vaccine is much worse than the methylmercury in fish. It metabolizes into organic mercury, which is the most lethal kind to neurons in your brain, and it crosses the blood-brain barrier in a week rather than 2 months. And then it stays in your brain for 27 years. At least that's what they know. causing inflammation. And I mentioned, when he told me, he mentioned another study called by a guy called Picciero, who's a CDC scientist, who had done these studies where he had given kids peanut butter sandwiches, or he had given the kids tuna sandwiches, and then looked at their blood, and the methylmercury was in their blood 54 days later. And he had given them a shot of thimerosal and looked at their blood, and the ethylmercury from the vaccine had disappeared within a week. And so he cited that study to me, but I knew that that study had been discredited. Immediately, people started writing letters to pediatrics saying, wait a minute, where did the mercury go? Just because it left their blood, it didn't mean it left their body. And Picciero couldn't find the mercury in the feces or the sweat or the hair or the fingernails or the urine of those children. And then Burbacker came along 2 years later and did these studies on monkeys, and the same thing happened. The methylmercury was in the blood a month later. The ethylmercury was gone in a week, and then he sacrificed the monkeys, which means killed them, looked in their brain, and found out where the mercury had gone. It was all in their brains from vaccines. So it turns out the vaccine mercury is much, much worse than the mercury in fish. And they were either pretending they didn't know that, because everybody had read those studies who had anything to do with public health, or they were, genuinely ignorant. But Francis Collins didn't know anything about it, who's Tony Fauci's boss. Oh, I knew. And then something happened, and this kind of gets to your initial question, which is a woman named Lynn Redwood gave me a document that she had obtained through a congressional committee. And the document was the transcript of a secret meeting at Simpson Wood, which is a Methodist retreat center in the wooded banks of the Chattahoochee River. And what had happened is the vaccine schedule changed in 1989. So I got 3 vaccines as a kid. My kids' generation gets 72 vaccines, mandatory. And the big change happened in 1989 because they passed the Vaccine Act in 1986, giving immunity from liability to the vaccine companies. And suddenly the cost of downstream liability was removed from those companies. So there was a gold rush to put all these new vaccines on the schedule. And by 89, they were tripling the amounts of mercury and aluminum in the vaccine schedule. And it takes 4 years for autism to be diagnosed. So the average age of diagnosis is 4.2 years. By 95, you started seeing this explosion in autism. In my generation, autism rates are 1 in 10,000. And by the year 2000, it was 1 in 600. Today, it's 1 in every 15 boys, or 1 in every 20 boys in this country. And so it was expanding exponentially. And everybody was wondering, where's it coming from? And there was a lot of mothers and other people were saying, it's the vaccines. I saw it happen. I gave my kid the vaccine. He was perfectly healthy, and he became autistic within 3 months later, after a series of seizures and fevers, etc. And the CDC back then, the concrete hadn't hardened on the orthodoxy yet, so they weren't just knee-jerk denying it. We just deny everything. At that point, people were still open to it, and there was dialogue, and there was not censorship. The press was writing about it back then. So CDC actually said, let's look at this. We'll do a study. And luckily, they have a database at CDC where all the answers to all the questions are, and it's called the Vaccine Safety Data Link. It's the biggest repository for health and vaccine. They got all the health records from 10 HMOs, 10 million, more than 10 million American health records. The top 10 HMOs all store their records there, and those records have every health claim, plus they have every vaccination down to batch. So you can look at any vaccine and do a cluster analysis and figure out whether it's associated with a particular illness. And So they hired a Belgian epidemiologist and biostatistician named Thomas Verstraeten in 1999. And they said, look at whether the vaccines are causing autism, and particularly mercury. That's what they thought was doing it. And so he took one of the mercury vaccines, which is the hepatitis B vaccine, and it was given to every child on the day of birth. And it was the main suspect, that and DTaP, which also had mercury in it. DTaP is diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. But Verstraeten and his team took the children who had received the DTaP vaccine the hepatitis B vaccine within the first 30 days of life. And then the control group were children who had not. So they had either received it later than the first 30 days or they had not received it at all. And they were all clustered in one group. And when Verstraeten ran the numbers, he was blown away because there was an 1,135% greater risk for getting an autism diagnosis among the kids who had had that vaccine in the first 30 days. And just for context, that's called statisticians call that an 11.35 relative risk. The relative risk for smoking a pack of cigarettes a day for 20 years and getting lung cancer is 10. This was 11.35, so they know it. And by the way, relative risk of 2 equals causation as long as there's biological plausibility. Right? So as long as it's plausible that this, what they mean by that is there's a relative risk between yellow fingers and lung cancer. But it's not, so people who have lung cancer, a huge number of them have yellow fingers. They've been smoking cigarettes. It's not the yellow fingers that's causing the cancer. It's a correlation, but it's not causation. And so you have to say, is it biologically plausible that fingers are causing cancer? No. But if it is, if it's the smoke, that's biologically plausible. And a relative risk of 2 is considered proof of causation. They had 11.35, so they knew then and there, CDC knew what was causing the autism epidemic, and they went to DEFCON 1, 5-alarm fire. They hit all the buttons. They quietly summoned all of the gurus of vaccinology, FDA, WHO, CDC, HHS, NIH, the top people in each of those agencies on vaccine, and then all of the 5 companies, Lilly, Merck, Sanofi, Glaxo, and Pfizer, representatives of those companies, and then the academics who develop vaccines at universities around the country, the leading academic vaccine developers. And there were 52 people, and they didn't want to bring them to the CDC campus because they thought then they would be susceptible to a freedom of information request, and they wanted to make sure nobody got wind of this. And it was a secret meeting, and it happened in 2002 at Simpsonwood. And for some reason, which nobody has ever explained, they allowed it to be recorded. And I got a hold of the transcript. And it's one of the most horrifying things that I had ever read in my life, because for the first day, all of these pangerums of public health are sitting there talking about how bulletproof the science is. And now we know it's causing autism, and there's no way to argue this. There's no way to win it in court. They talked about how frightened they were that the lawyers would find out about this and that they would shut down the industry. And then the second day, they spend the whole day talking about how to hide it from the American people. And at the end, they said, we're embargoing this. Everybody has to hand in their copy of the study. And we're all going to agree not to talk about this. And that's what they do. And then they go out and they fabricate these studies in Denmark. And, and then there's a whole tale that after that of how they invent or, they use biostitutes, which are the sort of industry-friendly scientists, and these in-house people at CDC to create a whole infrastructure of phony studies to try to, justify that vaccines do not cause autism. I know every one of their studies, and I can take it apart if anybody's, if anybody was ever interested in seeing it. We've dissected every one. So I wrote about it in Rolling Stone magazine and in Salon. And I published excerpts from that transcript, and it caused a huge storm. And then Salon, I think 3 years later, withdrew my article and said they were stripping it from the site because it was scientifically, because it was it had been debunked. It hadn't been debunked, and nobody ever showed me. They never told me in advance they were going to do that. They never gave me a chance to defend it. So no publisher does that. If somebody is criticizing your article, your publisher goes and says, he's on your team, at least in the beginning, until he's convinced that you're wrong. He comes to you and says, show me how to defend it, because it's humiliating for them to drop it. They did their full fact-checking on it. They did all the fact-checking that they're supposed to do. They knew it was right, and they took it down. They pressured. And incidentally, David Talbot, who was the founder of Salon, condemned that move by Salon and said they had caved into pharma. Rolling Stone kept it up and refused to retract it and stood by it. And that was my first experience with the censorship. And what happened, I don't think I've ever talked about this live. When I was about to publish this, we sent copies to the networks. And Jake Talbot called me up personally and said, I want to do this. I want an exclusive. I don't want anybody else to have it. And we're going to do it the day that Rolling Stone publishes it. We're going to do a huge story on this. And this is horrifying, and it needs to get out to the American people. And so the day that Rolling Stone came out, and we were very excited because Jake Tapper, who was then working, I think, was he working for CBS or ABC at that time, on the nightly news. And I worked with his film crew for almost a month doing filming the whole thing. And they had been down to Simpsonwood. They'd been all over the country. They had the whole story. He called me at around noon the day that it was supposed to air and said, something's happened to me that I'm humiliated about, which is, for the first time in my life, corporate has ordered me not to publish a piece, not to go with a piece. And so clearly the advertisers had told him. He said he was angry. Then within 2 days, he stopped answering my phone calls. And, and that was really my first experience with the censorship. And the censorship has been tightening ever since then. I've never been able to, I normally was publishing an op-ed every 6 months for the New York Times. I had a deal with them. They had come to me and said, will you give us one? And that's the maximum you can publish for the New York Times, once every 6 months. They said, we want you to do that regularly. And I was doing that for many years. And then they just said, we don't want to publish anything from you anymore. Not only about vaccines, but about any subject, because they didn't want to give me credibility. The other, I have not been able to publish. I published a couple of probably 5 editorials in HuffPost in 2008, and that was the last. And 3 years ago, HuffPost removed all those, so you can't historically even access them, which is really weird. No publication does that. And, we now have them on our website. When we knew they were going to do that, they started doing it with all the old vaccine articles. They went back and did the purge. But, the liberal media, the liberal blogosphere, which is supposed to be the antidote to corporate control of American democracy, Salon, Slate, Daily Beast, BuzzFeed, Politico, Mother Jones are all in bed with pharma. And, and then the New Republic, of course, and all of these, they will not publish anything that challenges the pharmaceutical orthodoxy. And of course, the television networks, I haven't been on for over a decade. I was on Bill Maher because he doesn't have advertising and is very courageous. And then I went on, I've been on Colbert, and I was on the Daily Show, and Jon Stewart was on there, but they were both forced to retract. They had Paul Offit on a week after me to say everything he said was wrong, and have never allowed me on again. So the blowback they got was clear. And really the only way that we could communicate to people was through social media. And the social media now in the last 5 years has slowly imposed a really dramatic draconian censorship so that Google and Bing, which are the search engines, are deliberately rigged to make sure you don't get any real information about vaccine safety.
I'm aware of that, especially as of the last couple of days of preparing my notes for this conversation, and wanting to find some of your past articles and things like that. And the first 10 hits that come up on Google
are all CDC and WHO.
Yeah, and they're all extremely critical and biased and unscientific. Right. To my eye.
Right. They don't. There's no citations. It's just this has been debunked. And by the way, the fact checker app, which they all use, the fact checker service, which they all use, they use PolitiFact, Poynter, or Fact Checker, and they're all funded by Bill Gates, who's the world's biggest vaccine maker. And they say openly,
brutal.
We are going to rely on WHO, which is Bill Gates' organization, and CDC, which Bill Gates is one of the biggest funders, and all of the pharmaceutical industries are funders to the CDC Foundation, which controls the CDC. And we're going to rely on, essentially they're saying we're going to rely on the industry to tell us what is true, what is vaccine misinformation. They use the term vaccine and misinformation as a euphemism for anything that challenges government or pharmaceutical industry pronouncements about vaccine. It actually has nothing to do with misinformation, because there's a constant flow of misinformation, of vaccine misinformation on CNN, on Facebook, on all of these other, Pinterest and Google. But the only stuff they're not trying to get rid of, whether it's true or not true is irrelevant. Whether it encourages people to get more vaccines and to not think about risks, that will be allowed on, even if it's completely erroneous, false, unsupported by science, and something that is, has 10 citations but is critical of vaccines, is wiped out and blacked out.
It really is becoming a science fiction dystopia,
yeah,
as you indicated.
It
is. I'm obviously a few years younger than you, but even going back to my 30s and thinking about how information was shared in the media and the beginnings of social media, if you could just snapshot that versus the way things are now, I mean, we've come so far in terms of limiting access to truth for the general public and the suppression of voices that oppose those powers. I want to ask you specifically, this is the question I get, and I'm sure you're very familiar with this, but whenever I pose questions about the safety of vaccines, et cetera, then the first question I get is, oh, so you're an anti-vaxxer. And I would say if I had to answer that, technically, yes, but more so that I would just be concerned that there is very little, if any, safety testing for vaccines. So what's the deal with the testing model? Is it does it exist at all? Are any of them ever tested for safety?
Here's the thing, and I'll tell you what happened. And by the way, I'm not anti-vaccine. They call me anti-vaccine because it's a way to marginalize me and to dismiss me. And instead of, actually debating the science, which they can't afford to do. Nobody will ever debate me. Nobody has ever debated me. Every time somebody agrees to debate me, they are dissuaded from doing so prior to the debate. In fact, 6 months ago, the Connecticut State Legislature asked me to do a debate. They were going to stack it against me. It was me against 5 Yale medical school virologists and immunologists. And we were each going to get 8 minutes. So I would get 8 minutes and they would get 40, but that was fine with me because I only need 8 minutes. And I flew out on a red eye from LA to Hartford. And I got there in the morning and went to the debate in the State House. And it was me and 5 empty chairs. They never showed up. That's happened to me on every single debate that I've tried to do over the past 15 years. They will not debate. And they try to silence our side by saying, oh, those are just anti-vaxxers. Most people they call anti-vaxxers are not, naturopaths who were ideologically anti-vax. They're mainly moms of children with intellectual disabilities who were completely pro-vax and were vaccinating all their kids according to the schedule until one of the kids got sick. And then they went and started doing the research. And they went to the internet but an internet site called PubMed, which is the NIH site, which has all the peer-reviewed publications. And you can go on there and, you can see what the science actually says. And these moms are very, very well informed. So what happened with vaccines is that, like I said, I had 3 vaccines when I was a kid. And today's kids, they get 72 doses of about 16 different antigens or vaccines. And it changed in 89. But what happened is in the early 80s, I got the 3 vaccines. I was born in 54. In 1986, there were 11 vaccines. And one of the ones they mandated around 79 or 80 was the DTP vaccine, the diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. And it was a very dangerous vaccine. And it killed a lot of kids and it caused brain damage. I think 1 in 300 kids were getting injured. It's now discontinued. You can't, in Western countries, white countries, nobody uses this. All the agencies have banned that DTP vaccine. It is, Gates gives it. Every child in Africa, 161 million kids a year are getting this horrendously dangerous vaccine. And the Danish government funded a study, a really important, really profound, good study that shows that girls who get that vaccine are 10 times more likely to die within 2 months than children who do not get it. So it is a lethal vaccine. It's probably killed millions of people. Gates and WHO know this. There's been a lot of international debate about that study, and they continue to force it on African countries. The countries have no choice because the WHO controls all of the funding for their health departments and their HIV programs and threatens them if you don't, meet our metrics for vaccinating your kids with DTP. We're going to pull that money. It's a very, very bad, it's a real colonial system. But anyway, the DTP in this country was introduced here and in England simultaneously, and it caused a lot of injuries. And people back then, you could sue the companies. There were lawyers bringing lawsuits, and they were getting, $20 million judgments. And the Wyeth and the other vaccine companies, Wyeth is now Pfizer, but back then it was called Wyeth, went to Congress and said in 86 and said, we're getting out of the vaccine space. And they said, we are losing $20 in downstream damages for every dollar we make in vaccine sales. And we're going to stop making all vaccines. And they said, you cannot make a vaccine safely. They said, and that phrase is actually in the statute that Congress passed. It is that they're unsafe. You can't make them safely, and so they said, we're going to get out unless you give us immunity from liability. So in '86, Congress passed, and then Ronald Reagan signed a statute that is called VICA, or the Vaccine Act, and it says no matter how sloppy the line protocols are now, no matter how negligent the company is, no matter how toxic the ingredient, no matter how grievous the injury to your child, you cannot sue them for liability. And so the companies which already said this vaccine is so horrendously dangerous that we can't make it safely, now has no incentive to make it safe because nobody can sue them. And then they looked at it and they said, holy cow, now we've got a product that the biggest cost for every other medical product is downstream liability. And that's been taken away. Not only that, vaccines are exempt from safety testing. Why are they exempt? That seems almost insane. I'm sure there's people who are watching this and saying, he's making that up. That couldn't be true because everybody tells us they're safety tested. But
I mentioned that to someone today and they went, that's impossible.
Yeah.
Of course. I mean, are you kidding me?
Well, here's the reason. It's an artifact of CDC's legacy as the Public Health Services, which was the predecessor agency for CDC. And the Public Health Services was a military agency. And that's why people at CDC have ranks like Surgeon General, and they have military ranks, and they wear uniforms because they're still a quasi-military agency. And the vaccine program was conceived as a national security defense against biological attacks in our country. So they wanted to make sure if the Russians attacked us with anthrax or some other biological agent, that we quickly could formulate a vaccine and then deploy it to the 200 million American civilians with no regulatory impediments. They said, if we call it a medicine, we're going to have to safety test it because medicines have to be safety tested. They have to be double-blind placebo tested, and that usually lasts 5 years. Because there's injuries that have long diagnostic horizons, that have long incubation periods. You don't see cancer for 5 years. You don't see autism for 4 years. Food allergies, autoimmune diseases, you won't see them right away. You won't see them in a month or 45 days. You see them from years from now. So they said if we do that, we'll never be able to get this out if there's a military emergency. And so they said, here's the solution. We won't call it a medicine. We'll call it a biologic. And we'll make biologics exempt from safety testing.
Oh, my God.
And so when there was, and then,
crazy.
By the way, they have no downstream liability. They saved $200 million doing the phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3.
And that's $200 million off each vaccine individually, right? To get it through.
Yeah. And then they're saving money on marketing and advertising. They have no marketing and advertising costs because these products are mandated for 76 million American kids, and they have very high margins. And they just realized this is like a gold mine. It's like printing money, making vaccines, because all you have to do is get it on the schedule. It doesn't have to be safe. We don't have to safety test it. You just have to do some minor efficacy testing. And it's not real efficacy testing. You're just testing whether people develop antibodies. You're not even testing whether it prevents the disease. Oh, it's a really easy walk to get new. And, we sued them 2 years ago. ICANN, which is another organization, and Children's Health Defense, or me acting as an attorney. We sued HHS and said, show us one vaccine that has had placebo testing. And HHS, after a lot of litigation, came back and said there are none. Not one. Not one of the vaccines now on the schedule has ever been tested against a placebo in pre-licensing studies. So if they don't do those tests, nobody can tell you what the risk profile is for that product. It can't tell you whether that product is averting more harms than it's causing. And, we look at all the science. We have 1,400 studies on our site, on the Children's Health Defense site. And I can show you for almost every vaccine that the likelihood is that it's causing far more deaths and injuries than it is averting. And, the idea that we're mandating those products to healthy children, something's wrong with that. And particularly to unwilling people who say, no, I don't want to do that. Say you're going to have to do that anyway with an untested product. So what happened is, in 89, they started piling on. Between 89 and 91 particularly, there was a huge explosion in new vaccines on the schedule, including for stuff that there's no reason to have a vaccine for it. Hepatitis B. It's not casually contagious. It's a disease of prostitutes, promiscuous gay homosexuals, and drug addicts. A one-day-old baby has zero chance of any harm from that disease. And so, but they were making money on it, and they had all these new vaccines, and you saw beginning that year in 89, you saw an explosion of chronic diseases. And in fact, Congress said to EPA, tell us what year the autism epidemic began. And EPA scientists came back and they drew a red line and they said 1989. But it wasn't just, it's three big categories. It's SIDS, okay, which, is vaccine related and was part of first people started first seeing SIDS with the DTP vaccine. But then three main categories of disease exploded beginning in 1989. And anybody who's watching this who is my age, which I doubt there is anybody because I know they're all like your age, but they can tell you they never saw these. We never saw people with peanut allergies when I was growing up. We never saw it till 89 or autism or any of these diseases, but the neurodevelopmental diseases, ADD, ADHD, speech delay, tics, Tourette syndrome, narcolepsy, ASD, autism. The allergic diseases, food allergies, peanut allergies, anaphylaxis, eczema, never even heard of it. Now it's everywhere. And asthma and anaphylaxis. And then the autoimmune diseases, rheumatoid arthritis, juvenile diabetes, lupus, demyelinating diseases, and then irritated bowel syndrome, Graves' disease, Crohn's disease, all of these. There's hundreds of them. So there's 420 diseases that are listed on vaccine inserts as side effects, potential side effects of vaccines. And that's the only place that the vaccine companies tell the truth. Why? Because under the Vaccine Act, the only way you can sue a vaccine company is if they know of an injury and that is caused by their product and they fail to list it on the insert. So they list autism on vaccine inserts. They list all of those diseases that I told you are all listed as side effects on vaccine. They'll deny it everywhere else, but on the insert where it counts, they admit it. And all of those diseases, virtually all of those diseases have become epidemics since 1989. And the companies are now making between 50 and 60 billion. When I was a kid, vaccine companies were making 287 million a year. They're making between 50 and 60 billion a year selling vaccines. They're making 500 billion a year selling the remedies for injuries that are caused by vaccines. So they're selling my kids the EpiPens that are $600 a piece, the albuterol inhalers for asthma, the Advair, the Adderall, Concerta, Ritalin, the anti-seizure medication, the diabetes medications, the arthritis medications, all of these. And you think about this. If you Well, I had measles when I was a kid. I had 11 brothers and sisters. We all got measles, and it was a celebration because we didn't have to go to school for a week. It's not a big deal getting measles. For us, if you're healthy, the only people who died of measles, it was a 1 in 500,000. Think about that. We're dying of measles at 63 before the vaccine. 1 in 500,000. It was 400 people total. They were all kids who had severe malnutrition, and they weren't making vitamin A. And, this was before we had poverty programs. So you had these pockets of malnutrition in our country. And those were the people. But otherwise, it had already disappeared before the vaccine. Measles mortality had disappeared. 99% of measles mortality had disappeared before the vaccine was introduced. So you think about this. What is the cure for measles? It's self-curing. The treatment is vitamin C, vitamin A, and chicken soup. And you can't patent either of those. But if you give that kid a MMR shot, and that child now has seizures or epilepsy or IBS or Crohn's disease or Graves' disease for life, now you got a lifetime client who will never be cured or requires constant treatment with very, very expensive drugs. And if you look at the 20 top blockbuster drugs for all of those 4 companies that are making our vaccines, all of those drugs are for injuries that are known to be caused by or suspected to be caused by vaccines, and that are listed on their inserts as vaccine, products. And it's weird to me that Democrats, my party, who realize how corrupt these companies are, and say, they'll say, yeah, of course they lie. They're the worst companies. They manipulate. They lie. Their business model is criminal. Everybody knows that about those companies. And I mean, take this: the 4 companies, Pfizer, Merck, Glaxo, and Sanofi, have collectively paid $35 billion since 2009. That's over the last decade. In penalties, criminal penalties, damages, fines for defrauding regulators, to lying to doctors, lying to the public, falsifying science, bribing, blackmailing public officials, are criminal enterprises. And it's part of their culture. It's part of their business model to be involved in criminal activity constantly. All of these companies, I invite them to sue me if any of them disagree with me. And how do you think? So, and by the way, killing hundreds of thousands of people. Vioxx, which was Merck's blockbuster product, flagship product, till 2006, killed between 120,000 and 500,000 Americans. It was a pill that Merck marketed as a headache pill when Merck knew it caused heart attacks. Merck knew it because their clinical trials showed a lot of people were going to die from heart attacks. And in fact, when we sued them, we got spreadsheets from their bean counters saying, we're going to kill so many people, we're still going to make a killing on this drug because we're going to sell so many. So they knew. And the problem is they didn't tell anybody. So those people, a lot of those people who were taking Vioxx for their arthritis or for their headaches, if Merck had been honest and said it could kill you, a lot of them would have said, you know what, I'll take an aspirin. And I'm not going to take it. But Merck never gave them that choice. And it killed them. And then it ended up the entire Merck board of directors and upper staff should have gone to prison for life because they murdered those people. They knew they were going to kill them and they killed them. And they didn't tell them. They didn't allow those people to avoid. It's criminal. What's the difference between that and murdering somebody? There is no difference morally, ethically, or, technically. And they got out of it by paying $7 billion in penalties. And they withdrew the drug. That was in 2006. Why does anybody think? And the Democrats will say, yeah, they lie, they cheat, they steal, they kill people, they're murderous, they're pirate companies. But not when it comes to vaccines. With vaccines, they're telling the truth. And by the way, the vaccines is the only place they could never get caught. Because the way they got caught on all of those other capers was that private plaintiffs' attorneys who had clients who were injured or killed by the product sued them, conducted discovery, came across documents that showed criminal behavior, walked those documents down to the U.S. Attorney's Office and said, you should prosecute them criminally. That's how it happened. The only place that can never happen is with vaccines. The vaccines, you can't sue them. So there's no discovery, there's no depositions, there's no document searches. They can get away with it and nobody will ever know. And, what they've done is the one barrier would be the regulatory agencies who are supposed to be looking, but the regulatory agencies are utterly corrupted. FDA gets half of its budget from the industry, half.
That's crazy.
And CDC has an $11.5 billion annual budget, and $4.9 billion is from buying and selling vaccines. Oh, it's a vaccine company. These agencies own patents. CDC owns 57 patents. NIH probably owns hundreds. And when that patent is included in a vaccine, or it is a vaccine, like with Gardasil, they own the Gardasil patent. They own the COVID patent, right? Then they get to collect royalties. So the agency gets money on every sale of every vial. Not only that, but individuals in the agency, there's 4 individuals at NIH who worked on the COVID vaccine. Those individuals can collect $150,000 a year in royalties. They capped it a few years ago. It used to be unlimited. They were becoming, multimillionaires. Now they get $150,000 a year. It's not a regulatory agency. It's an arm of the industry. And it shouldn't be pretending to be regulating because it's not doing it.
I remember when Donald Trump was, I believe, nominated and running, he was talking a bit in the periphery about vaccines and autism and things like that. And then I never really heard him bring it up again that I'm aware of. I don't follow things that closely, but is he at all, do you think, aware of this and on the good side of it, or is he just giving them a pass?
He asked me to come talk to him about it at the beginning of his presidency, actually in January of 2017, so right before he took the oath of office. He called me, he asked me to come to Trump Tower in New York and meet with him. And I spent a day with him and with Bannon and Reince Priebus and Jared Kushner and Hope Hill and Kellyanne Conway, and met with half of them for hours and explained to them the whole thing. And he said that he wanted me to help him create a vaccine safety commission that I would lead, that would be able to sort of oversee the issue and ask the questions and get the science actually done. Do the studies that we need, order the studies that need to be done, the vaccinated versus unvaccinated study. What I've said to people is, show me a study that compares vaccinated population to a similarly situated unvaccinated population, and a study that shows that the vaccinated people have better health outcomes. If you show me that study, I will post it on my website and close down and leave and go back to Waterkeeper full time, which is what I want to do. But we've been able to go, the CDC will not allow that study to be made. HHS will not. Tony Fauci, who funds $6 billion of studies a year, will kill any study that tries to do that. Will blackball any scientist that tries to do it. And they have taken the Vaccine Safety Data Link, which is that database I told you, and they've closed it down so nobody can access it because they do not want people to do that study. And we have been able to go on PubMed and go into every corner and find that some scientists over the past 20 years have done versions of that study. And we found 60 of them, which I've posted at various times on my Instagram. And every one of them shows that the vaccinated kids are by far the sickest kids. They have the earaches. They have the emergency room visits. They have 5 to 10 times the special ed education rates. They have diabetes at 3 or 4 times vaccinated. They have allergic rhinitis, 30 times unvaccinated kids. And, you go through all of these different metrics and there's not one. We have not been able to find a single study that shows that vaccinated kids are healthier. They're always worse off. And, I'm just asking for the science that everybody that we would do for any other medical product. You look at whether the people who are taking the medicine are healthier than the people who aren't. And they can't do that with vaccines, and they know they can't, and they kill them. And, it's that's a big problem.
Did anything ever come of the meeting with Trump and his team?
Or did sorry. I got distracted.
That's okay. That was all good stuff. I'm just like, okay, what did he just drop it?
No, but what happened is he asked me to run the commission, and we announced it. And immediately they got just a storm, a hurricane, typhoon of blowback from the industry. And I don't know what calls were made behind the scene, but a couple of weeks later, I think a week later, Pfizer donated $1 million to the president's inauguration. And then he brought in Pfizer's handpicked candidate to run, both of them, Scott Gottlieb to run FDA and Alex Azar to run HHS. And they were both handpicked. They're both industry lobbyists, insiders, vaccine company presidents to come in and run the agencies, and they immediately shut us down. So the president arranged for us to have meetings with Fauci and Collins, and we had these really extraordinary meetings during the first couple of weeks of his presidency. And then those guys were brought in. The Pfizer people were brought in, and they completely shut us down, and they killed any communication with me or our team. And we've never heard from them since.
Wow. That could have been an opportunity there for progress,
One of the things I said to President Trump is this is not a heavy lift. All you have to do is authorize studies of the VSC, just order CDC to let independent scientists into the database, vaccine safety database, and to look at the data in there. And, the answers are all in there. And so it's not like you have to, say we're going to change, we're going to kill all the vaccines and we're going to change all the personnel or do something really a heavy lift that's momentous. They have built an edifice by piling fraud upon fraud upon fraud upon fraud. And it's so lofty now and so unwieldy that all you have to do is kick one brick out of the bottom of it and the whole thing will collapse because it's all just a web of lies and fraud. And all you need is good science, and good science will kill them. And that's why they can't let me speak. They have to say I'm anti-vax, which I'm not. If somebody comes up with a vaccine that does what they say a vaccine's supposed to do, which is to give you lifetime immunity from COVID with minimal health effects, like 1 in a million, which is what they say is acceptable, and I'm all for it. I'm not for mandating it. I don't think, the government has a right to force anybody to take medicine against their will. We signed a lot of treaties saying governments aren't allowed to do that anymore, after 1945, including the Nuremberg Charter we signed, which says you can't do that. You cannot force somebody to take a medicine against their will or submit to a medical intervention against their will. But I would take a vaccine that gave lifetime immunity and had no other side effects. I'm all for it. And let's make sure that it actually does that. And let's stop lying to people, and let's stop hiding the science. Let's make sure that we actually have science that shows that they're doing that. So, and the response, to me is to label me anti-vax and say I'm a dangerous person and I need to be silenced, that American people cannot afford to listen to dangerous, I might put dangerous thoughts and dangerous ideas in their heads. And they call me anti-vax. And, listen, I've been fighting for 40 years to get mercury out of fish. Nobody calls me anti-fish. Right. I'm not anti-vax. I like to have seatbelts in cars. It doesn't mean I'm anti-automobile. I want them to be safe. And, I think we ought to be able to have a civil debate on that in a democracy. I think if you don't, the censorship to me, is like the end of the world. Have Democrats like Adam Schiff telling these companies you need to censor, criticism of pharmaceutical products. That's shocking. I mean, my father and my uncle, they were like, they said, you can't censor anybody. They were angry when I was growing up. On your passports, it said you can't visit these countries, Cuba and China and North Korea. And my father and uncle were furious about that and told the State Department, change that. You can't tell, Americans can go anywhere. If we can't win these battles in the market of ideas and the market of debate, and we need to change the way we're doing things. And in a democracy, you have to trust the people. Otherwise, it becomes a tyranny overnight. And you have to educate the people, and they're all based on the free, unobstructed flow of information. And now this company, in order to maintain this fraud, has had to shut down, every aspect of us, of people like me communicating about it. And, I'm like, I'm not a marginalized figure. I win lawsuits against big companies, by persuading juries that the company did something wrong. I've been involved in some of the biggest lawsuits in history, including the Monsanto lawsuit, which just settled, which is for $12 billion, the third largest settlement in history. And I was on that trial team. I was on the trial team in the lawsuit against DuPont that's now the subject of the film Dark Waters. If I was a crazy person, judges would not let me near a jury. And I've been involved in hundreds of other lawsuits that have won by saying, we're going to show you what the real science says. We're going to, and I've been dealing with corrupted, captive agencies my entire career. But I've never seen anything like this, because these agencies are actually buying and selling vaccines. It's like, listen, the EPA is a captive agency. EPA is an arm of many of these industries, of the coal and oil and chemical industry. And when we did the Monsanto case, part of our proof was that the head of the pesticide division in EPA was fixing the science to protect Monsanto and falsifying, defrauding science to protect Monsanto. And we were able to show that to the jury, that they owned, that literally the guy who was running the pesticide division was blocking for Monsanto and killing studies and falsifying studies and allowing industry to ghostwrite studies and do all of these fraudulent criminal activities. I'm used to dealing with captive agencies, but this is like dealing with CDC is like as if EPA made half of its annual budget from the coal industry. These people are supposed to be regulating pharma, and they're making half their budget from pharma. And then they have a revolving door that is, amazing. I mean, Julie Gerberding, who approved most of these vaccines, the MMR, she gave the monopoly to Merck, the Gardasil vaccine, the chickenpox vaccine, the Zostarax are all her gifts to Merck. She ran CDC from 2002 to 2009, left in 2009, and exactly 12 months later, which is the legal limit, she became president of Merck's vaccine division with $2.5 million salary and stock options that are probably worth $30 million. She just sold a bunch of her Merck stock, just a portion of it for $9 million. So that was her payoff for giving Merck licenses that were worth tens of billions of dollars.
That's incredible. I want to acknowledge that, we talked about going for about an hour and we're at that now. I've got a couple more questions. How are you feeling?
Well, I'll take a couple more, okay. But I'm trying to get a brief out today.
No, I want to be respectful of that. So in summary of this then, it's been clearly illuminated that there's massive conflict of interest between these regulatory agencies and private industry. And I'm curious how that ties in to the COVID issue and the possibility of forced vaccinations as being the ultimate end goal of this craziness. If you could summarize briefly your take on that.
It's hard to summarize that briefly because that's a huge question. Because COVID has people have been trying to develop a coronavirus vaccine for decades, and they've never been able to. And for a number of reasons, but the big reason is there's a phenomena that is peculiar to coronavirus vaccines, which is a phenomena that is known as pathogenic priming, which is the vaccine. All the vaccines that they've made to date have provoked antibodies, but it's a bad kind of antibody. It's an antibody that instead of neutralizing antibodies, which fight off the disease the next time they see it, it's something called binding antibodies that actually turn your receptors in your body into Velcro for the vaccine, for the virus. And they make you much, much sicker than if you weren't vaccinated. And you can't tell until you're challenged, until you hit the wild virus, exposed to it. And what happened is, after 2002, there was a huge international consortium that was putting billions of dollars into developing coronavirus vaccines. It was the Chinese working with Tony Fauci and working with a lot of the Western nations, and they developed 30 prototype vaccines, and then they chose the 4 best in class. There was a couple of spike protein vaccines and a bunch of different kind of vaccines, and they developed those 4, and then they gave them to ferrets. And when they gave them to ferrets, the ferrets got great antibody responses, which is the metric that FDA uses to license new vaccines. So when a vaccine is licensed, they don't give 1,000 people the vaccine and 1,000 people a placebo and send them out to get exposed, and then look at 2 years later and say what happened to both groups. That has never happened. What they do is they give you the injection and they see if you got the antibodies. If a month later, if you developed antibodies, and there's a lot of problems with doing it that way, but I'm not going to go into those. But what they found when they injected the ferrets got a very robust and durable antibody response, which is what they are looking for. And they thought, we hit the jackpot. All 4 vaccines worked beautifully, but then something horrible happened. When they exposed those ferrets, when they challenged them with the wild virus, the ferrets died. And they were blown away. They thought, oh my God, what happened here? And then they remembered. And by the way, none of the unvaccinated ferrets died. So the vaccine actually made the virus much, much worse. And they remembered back in the 1960s, they had tried to develop a MERS vaccine. It was very similar to coronavirus. Mideast respiratory system, which is like It comes from camels. And they had injected a bunch of, they had done the animal studies, had shown good antibody response, but they never challenged the animals with wild MERS. And went right to human studies. They gave it to 35 kids and they got great antibody response. But then when the kids were challenged with the wild virus, they got horrendously sick and 2 of the children died. Wow. And they discontinued it. And then they didn't think about it for 40 years. And when they killed all those 50 years, when they killed all those ferrets in 2012, they remembered that. And they went, holy cow, that's what happened to those kids. And then in 2014, Sanofi did a dengue vaccine, which NIH was working on, Fauci's group, gave it to, and they had some flags, red flags during their clinical trials that indicated there may be a pathogenic priming problem. They went ahead and produced the vaccine and gave it to, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of kids in the Philippines. And when the wild dengue virus came around again, the kids who got vaccinated got horribly sick and 600 of them died. And today in the Philippines, I think there's 19 public health officials who are on criminal trial, charged with criminal recklessness for killing those kids. So that's the problem with this. That's one of the problems. The other problem is really, it's a problem that they're going to solve by, what I would call cooking the frog slowly. Everybody thinks when they, when they hear, okay, you're going to stay locked down until there's a vaccine. As Bill Gates said, a magical vaccine that we can give to 7 billion people. They're thinking that, the vaccine's going to do what we've been told vaccines do, which is to give everybody who gets one lifetime immunity and no, major health problems. What are the chances they're actually going to get a vaccine like that? I would say 0. And that's my prediction. And I could be wrong, but I would say 0. And all you have to do is look at the flu vaccine. We've had the flu vaccine. It was a much simpler vaccine to make. We've had it for 90 years. And they're fine-tuning it every year and trying to make it better. And it's still, here's what the Cochrane collaboration, which is the ultimate arbiter of pharmaceutical science. They look at all the studies and they're independent. They're not owned by pharma. And the British Medical Journal have done 3 meta-reviews of all the science on the flu vaccine. And here's what they found. Number 1, you have to give the flu vaccine to 100 people to prevent 1 case of flu. Number 2, there is 0 evidence that the flu vaccine prevents any hospitalizations or any deaths. And what Cochrane and BMJ said is, the flu vaccine may be, and we don't even know if the one person is getting benefits, but because they were looking, a lot of the studies were industry funded and they thought they exaggerate the benefit. They said it's, what it may do at best is stop flu symptoms in 1 kid. Who cares? What you're telling us, we're taking a flu vaccine to protect the elderly from death. And they said also that the flu vaccine, which CDC tells people you won't transmit the flu to elderly people, actually, people who get the vaccine transmit the flu 6 times the rate of people who are unvaccinated. So when you get that vaccine, you become an asymptomatic carrier of flu. You are spreading the flu. And so that is the truth about the flu vaccine. And coronavirus vaccine, is much more difficult. And so the likelihood is that, here's what I predict. I predict you're going to be seeing Bill Gates and Tony Fauci week after week dampening expectations about the vaccine. They were originally saying it's a magical vaccine we're going to give to everybody and everybody is going to be immune. And they're going to say, well, actually only 80% of people will get immune, and then they'll say 70%, and they'll say 50%, and then they'll say 20%. But it's still worth it to have 20%, and they'll try to sell us on that. Okay, and they'll have no data that show that the people we actually want to protect, fragile elderly, people with comorbidities, people with chronic disease, that any of them get any benefit from it. They may be able to show that some kids don't get coronavirus, 3 months after they got the vaccine. And then they're going to say, well, the vaccine, it's not actually lifetime immunity. The immunity only lasts for 1 year, one season, and actually maybe not even that, maybe only 2 or 3 months, and then you have to get another one. And then they'll be able to cover up the injuries because there is no functional surveillance system for vaccine injuries. So if somebody gets injured by a vaccine, it doesn't say on their death certificate, there's no category for vaccine death. There's and the doctors are voluntarily, the only reporting system is the doctor voluntarily says the vaccine I gave that person killed them. If you get a vaccine and 2 days later you die of a seizure, most doctors will say that's not related to the vaccine. That was just, a bad coincidence. And so you're not, and because there's no surveillance system that can actually do cluster analysis and machine counting, you'll never see it. So they'll be able to hide the injuries from the public, which is what they do with every vaccine. The HHS's own study said that fewer than 1% of vaccine injuries are ever recorded. Fewer than 1%. So that could be 0.0001%. Their study, their 2010 study on the whole system said fewer than 1% are reported. And they deliberately, that their system is designed to fail. And they want it that way because they do not want to acknowledge the huge, the actual rate of vaccine injuries in this country, according to that study, was 2.6%. And there's many other studies, including the clinical data from the companies, that indicate that. That means that there are serious injuries occur with every 40 vaccines, 37 to 40 vaccines. You have serious injuries like lifetime injuries or permanent autoimmune disease. And all of these diseases are now epidemic. And it's not a mystery where they're coming from. I'm not saying vaccines is the only reason we have a chronic disease epidemic, because our children are swimming around in a toxic soup today. They're drinking fluoride from their taps, which is injuring them terribly. They're getting glyphosate and pesticides in all of their food. They're being bombarded by 5G. And all of those things are contributing to this health epidemic in our children. The worst one by far is the vaccines. And I'm not saying that because of my opinion. I'm saying it because I read the science all day. And it's horrific.
Wow. Well, thank you for illuminating all of this for us today. I want to leave on a positive note, but it's like, wow, we're screwed. I do have one final question that's a quick one that I ask all my guests. You've taught me an incredible amount of information. I'm going to have to listen to this 5 times to take it all in, as are many. Who have been 3 teachers or teachings in your life that have influenced you in your work?
Well, I had a school teacher. I had a great school teacher called Skip Lorenz when I was a biology teacher. And then when I was a kid, that was the best teacher that I had in high school. I had a wonderful teacher on evolutionary biology named Robert Trivers when I was in college, and who's a very famous evolutionary biologist. I'd say the inspirations in my life, my dad was a fantastic teacher, and particularly history and values. My whole, family, my grandmother, my grandfather really tried to instill us with, an idea that of that our country was an exemplary nation, and that that you got happiness not through pursuing self-will, but of trying to transcend self-will and find some other compass, a higher power, or just service to other people. That was, that had a magical impact on people's lives and transformative, not of the people that you serve, but on the person who's, what St. Francis said, which was, we are not what we accumulate. We are what we give away. And, and I guess I had a lot of Catholic priests in my life who were extraordinary influences. A father called Father Creedon, who was our family priest. I lived with Mary Noel Priest when I was in high school in Peru, in a mission there, who had an extraordinary influence on me. And then there's a lot of my family members, a lot of my cousins, my aunt, Shriver, who was my godmother. I'm lucky that I have a lot of family members, even my generation, my cousin Timmy Shriver, who inspire me. And I'm very, very lucky to have been surrounded my whole life with very powerful women and very powerful men who are all driven by idealism and intellectual curiosity, and a fearless intellectual curiosity. And, those things I think, have made my life a lot richer. They've made me kind of willing to take risks and to see my life as a journey, and also my family was a very kind of odd combination of pious Catholics combined with a complete irreverence, particularly for the upper clergy, and for human institutions in general. And you have, I guess, who was it who said, was it Augustine, who said that you have to be able to hold two opposing thoughts in your head at the same time. And that's that's the sign of a refined mind. And so I grew up with that ambiguity of people who were deeply, deeply immersed in religious faith, but at the same time were very, very irreverent and skeptical towards all religious authorities and all secular authorities. And just said, my father said to me when I was a kid, he said, people in power lie. And if you want to live in a democracy, you better be skeptical about everything that is said by anybody who is powerful. And, I think that's one of the guiding themes that that has been an important part of my worldview.
Clearly has. Thank you so much, man, for sharing your time and wisdom and experience today. Much appreciated. And I look forward to sitting down again. And we did get to end on a positive note. That was actually beautifully inspiring. And I can see how that influence has come through your life and your work, which is just a great way to sum it up. And I thank you, and we'll see you again.
Thank you.